Chapel of Love by the Dixie Cups. It's been like 50 years since you heard that song. We're talking this morning about President Obama coming out in support of same-sex marriage, what many people consider to be one of the last civil rights battles in America. Listen.
At a certain point, I've just concluded that, for me personally, it is important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married.
That was the president talking to Robin Roberts. The president also revealing that his evolution was not just political. He said he'd been talking about the issue with his wife and his daughters, and they helped sway his stance. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney, quick to make sure his supporters knew where he stands. Listen.
I do not favor marriage between people of the same gender, and I don't favor civil unions if they're identical to marriage other than by name.
Richard Socarides is a former senior advisor to former President Bill Clinton. He's also a writer for TheNewYorker.com. Nice to have you with us this morning. Let's talk political implications. You were working with President Clinton when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was drafted, and also the Defense of Marriage Act. So when you hear about this evolution of President Obama, maybe I should do evolution of President Obama, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's striking evidence of how far we've come as a country and how far we've come in the debate on these social issues, and how dramatically that shift has occurred. I mean, you're right. In 1996, President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. We all knew he didn't want to sign it, but he was in the middle of a tough re-election, and his political advisors convinced him that it was too risky not to sign it, you know, after the Republicans rushed it through Congress. Today, though, yesterday, I think President Obama rejected a lot of the political advice he was getting from his advisors. That was the same advice people were giving President Clinton 16 years ago, and was saying, no, I'm going to do the right thing. And luckily, the mood in the country, the public opinion in the country had shifted enough so that he could do that. It was a real profile in courage, I think, on the president's part.
It's a profile in courage, if you will, up to a certain point, right? Because in a sentence later, he says, these are my personal feelings, and in fact, I believe states should decide.
Well, you know, I thought he was pretty clear yesterday. I don't think there was any equivocation. We know where he stood. He talked about his family. You know, states have traditionally decided their own marriage laws. I think it's clear, you know, his Justice Department is out in front in the federal court cases, making clear that they don't believe that any state should be allowed to discriminate based upon sexual orientation. So I think that states, letting individual states decide was a little bit of a qualifier, but I think really in context it was very small.
You know, Richard, I have to say, I'm sorry, Richard, I disagree with you a little bit. I think that he deserves a ton of credit for the symbolic the symbolism of what he did yesterday. It's the first president ever to endorse gay marriage. But I do think we have to qualify what Soledad said, that it was a personal endorsement. Essentially, he said, it's something I support, but I'm not going to fight for. And the president's record on federalism, the issue of giving states rights to determine issues, isn't stellar. It's not one of his core virtues or one of his core principles. So I do think he left himself an out. I do think he attempted to leave himself an out. And I'm not sure. Well, I am sure why, because I'm not sure he's ready to take all that political risk yet.
Let's talk about the political risk, too. What is the political risk here?
Well, this is, you know, marriage equality is we're pretty evenly divided as a country on marriage equality. The polls now show that a majority of Americans support it, but it's a bare majority. So it's going to probably help him in some places, but it may hurt him in other places, and that's what leadership is about. I think, though, it positions him very nicely in the campaign as someone who is thoughtful, deliberate, willing to take risks and lead on principle. So I think it's very consistent with what his election strategy is going to be. And I think to do otherwise, to kind of have this muddled position during the campaign, would have really hurt him.
Richard, voting is the ultimate poll. That's the ultimate poll. When there have been same-sex amendments where people voted, supporters are 0 for 32. Yeah. So you have a national poll that says one thing, but you have 32 different elections that say something totally different. Yeah. And so
many of them in swing.
So what is going on there where people are saying one thing in polls nationally, but when it's put to a vote, something else. And so a presidential election is also a state-by-state election.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. And I think, you know, it means that in places like the South, we still have a lot of progress to make.
But those 32 states are not just in southern states.
California.
Well, California, too, and it's very close in California. You know, the polling now in California shows that if the vote were held today, it would be overwhelmingly the other way. Look, I think that the forces against this have been extremely clever. Sometimes they've been clever, sometimes they've been very lucky in these state-by-state ballot initiatives. We're going to start to win some. We're going to probably win this next one in Maine. But
Maine, Minnesota,
Maine and Minnesota coming up in November. This one in North Carolina, they were, strategic, perhaps. Some would say clever in putting it on during a primary in May, when the traditional, you didn't really get a representative sample even in North Carolina of people coming to the polls because the election was in May, it was a primary. But you're right, I mean, we're not going to win everywhere, and it will probably hurt him in some places, but I think with young voters will be enthused, I think progressive Democratic-based voters will be enthused, and I think it is, what the president did yesterday is totally consistent with everything we know about him.
Do you want to jump in?
I just want to say, I think this is a calculated decision on his part. The way,
not an evolution, but
the way McCain chose Palin at the time, he thought this was going to be a game changer. And I think that that Obama thinks this is going to change the whole face of the election. Is going to change what people are talking about, and he thinks it's going to get him to win.
And you think that's because social issues?
It may be wrong, but I think that he thinks it's going to be the thing that'll get him to win.
And do you think that's because social issues are what sort of make people emotional and then drive them to the polls? If you look at how young people poll on gay marriage, overwhelming support. If you look at sort of the older white blue-collar voters against
look what we're talking about. Everything was the economy up until yesterday. Now all I hear about is gay marriage.
It's today. That's what we're talking about next month.
It's going to be the economy again. I mean, this election is going to be won or lost over who voters think are going to be best to lead the economy. But I would say that, this issue, when Mitt Romney comes up now and says, well, I'll support civil unions so long as you don't get any rights with civil unions. I mean, he looks like, grandpa in this. I mean, this is just what Mitt Romney was trying to avoid. He starts to look in this.
Talk to Tony Perkins, he says now evangelicals say that's our guy. We were not motivated before, and now we're really motivated to support him.
I don't think there's anybody out there who, I think there are very few people who vote on just this issue, and I think those people were going to vote for Mitt Romney anyway. They're going to come out for Mitt Romney. They were going to come out to defeat Barack Obama because they hate Barack Obama.
Doesn't this also just push it further where the Supreme Court will have to ultimately decide?
That's absolutely right.
Because you can't have states voting and state courts judging.
You're absolutely right. The Supreme Court is going to decide this issue, not this year, but probably next year or the year after.
And right. I mean, we'll talk about this more, so I won't throw in my 2 cents before we get to commercial break. Thank you, Richard Socarides. Nice to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up on our next hour, we're going to talk about how religion plays into the announcement. Mega church